My name is Dahlia Marsh, and I was 31 the morning I drove my car to my brother's rehearsal dinner and parked it for the last time without knowing it in the lot of the Hargrove Inn off Route 9. I remember the temperature that night, 43 degrees, the kind of cold that settles into the joints and stays. I remember the smell of the heating vents when I walked through the lobby doors. That particular mix of industrial carpet cleaner and someone else's perfume that all hotel lobbies share. I remember sitting across from my brother Cade and his fiancée Petra and her parents and smiling through three courses and a toast that Cade gave about family being the bedrock of everything a person builds. He was good at speeches. He always had been. He had a voice that made you believe the words while he was saying them, and then you drove home afterward and the words started to dissolve, and by morning there was nothing left of them except the vague feeling that you had agreed to something without fully knowing what it was. I should tell you about who I was before I tell you about what happened, because I think the who matters more than most people realize when they hear a story like this one. The who is the thing that explains the how, and the how is the thing that makes the why make sense. I have worked in vehicle title and registration compliance for 9 years. I started as a processor at a regional DMV contractor when I was 22, moved into auditing at 25, and by the time I was 29, I was running the compliance desk for a fleet management company that handled title transfers for corporate vehicle pools across 3 states. I know what makes a vehicle transfer legal and what makes it fraudulent. I know the difference between a signed title and a forged one, between a notarized lien release and a photocopied one, between a clean vehicle history and one that has been carefully scrubbed. I know the difference between a transfer that has been processed correctly and one where someone has filled in a field that should be empty, or emptied a field that should be filled. I know these things the way a person knows how their own kitchen is arranged in the dark. You do not need to think about it, you just move through it, and your hands find what they are looking for. I had owned the Subaru for 6 years when all of this happened. A 2014 Outback, silver with cloth interior, 74,000 miles on the odometer the day I bought it, used from a private seller in Henley County. I paid $11,400 for it. I paid cash, which I had saved over 2 years for exactly that purpose. I drove 40 minutes each way to look at it twice before I bought it, and I ran the VIN through every database I had access to, which at that point was more databases than most people know exist, and everything came back clean. The title was in my name alone. I had never added anyone to it. I had never signed a power of attorney over the vehicle to anyone. I had never allowed anyone to handle the registration renewal on my behalf. I did those things myself, every year, because I had worked long enough in title compliance to understand in my bones that the easiest way to lose something is to let someone else hold the paperwork. There was a small cardboard air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. Pine scent, the cheap kind that comes in a thin plastic sleeve, the kind you see at every gas station counter in the country. My father had bought me the first one the day I brought the car home. He had been standing in my parking space when I pulled in, and before I could even get out, he walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, reached past me, and looped the little card over the mirror stem himself. He said, "This is your car, Dee, nobody else's." He had a way of saying obvious things that made them feel like something larger than obvious, something that had been decided somewhere above the conversation. He died 14 months after I bought that car. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by the following December. He went fast, which everyone said was a mercy, and I suppose it was, though I've never been entirely sure who the mercy was designed to serve. When the first air freshener faded, I bought another one exactly like it. Pine, same brand, same plastic sleeve. Then another. By the time of Cade's rehearsal dinner, I was on my fifth one. The car always smelled faintly of pine, which was the point. Which I did not examine too closely. I kept the empty plastic sleeves folded flat in the glove compartment, 4 of them by that point stacked neatly. I am not a sentimental person as a rule. I do not keep things for no reason. But some things you keep without making a formal decision about it, and later you understand that the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of thought. I grew up in a house where money was handled carefully because it had to be, not because my parents were careless, but because the arithmetic of two working parents and two children and a mortgage and a car payment and the 10,000 ordinary costs of keeping a household running in a mid-sized city does not leave much margin. And I understood this earlier than most children understand it. I understood it the way a child who pays attention understands things that no one has formally explained to them, by watching the particular stillness that came over my mother's face when she looked at the mail, by understanding that certain conversations my parents had behind closed doors were not arguments but calculations. I do not say this to invoke any particular sympathy. I say it because it is the thing that explains why I am good at my job, which is a job that requires you to see the paper clearly and not the story that the paper is wrapped in. My mother and father were honest people. That is the foundational thing. They were honest and they were hardworking and they loved us specifically, not generally, with the particular attention that sees one child and knows that child rather than seeing children as a category. My father knew that Cade needed to be seen to thrive and that I needed to be left alone to thrive, and he managed both things without making either of us feel like we were being managed. He was a careful man, that is the word I would use. Careful, in the old sense, full of care. I did not understand until after he died how much of my steadiness came from watching him. He was steady the way water at the bottom of something is steady, not because nothing moves it but because it has found its level. Cade is 4 years older than me. He has always been the one our mother called first when something needed to be handled, deferred to first when there was a disagreement, forgiven first when there was something to forgive. Not because he is a genuinely cruel person. I want to be exact about this because I think imprecision is one of the ways these stories go wrong. Cade is not a cruel person by nature. He is a frightened one. His cruelty, when it came, did not come from a place of malice, but from a place of panic, specifically the panic of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he was one perceived failure away from being exposed as less than the world expected him to be. Petra's family had money. Not extraordinary wealth, not the kind that fills newspapers, but the quiet kind that announces itself in specific ways. A lake house in Michigan that they had owned for 23 years, a mother who wore shoes that cost what a plane ticket costs and never seemed to notice, a father who spoke about his financial advisor with the casual first-name familiarity of someone who has never had to worry about whether the advisor would take his call. They were not cruel people either. But they were people with expectations. The kind of expectations that do not get stated because they do not need to be stated. The kind that hang in the air of every conversation like furniture you have to walk around. Cade had a sales job. Base plus commission, with the commission being unpredictable in the way all commission structures are unpredictable. Reliable in good quarters and frightening in slow ones. He had shared an apartment with a roommate until he was 33. He had borrowed money from me, small amounts, 20 here, 100 there. Once a full $450 that I lent him in January of one year, and that he had not mentioned again by the following January, or the January after that. I had stopped tracking the total at $2,000 because I had decided that tracking it was making me into a person I did not want to be, but I knew the number. I remembered all of the individual transactions the way I remember all documentation. Not from effort, just from the way my memory is structured. He asked me for $8,000 11 months before the wedding. He called it a loan. He called it during a phone call in the evening that started as a casual check-in and gradually, through a series of conversational steps that I recognized as deliberate even while he was executing them, arrived at the number. He said Petra's family expected a certain caliber of rehearsal dinner venue and that he wanted to start the marriage on even footing rather than at a disadvantage. That was the specific word he used, disadvantage. As if marrying into a family with more money than you had was a race you were beginning from behind, and the right venue would move the starting line. I told him I did not have $8,000 available to lend, which was true. I told him that what I did have was committed to other things, which was also true. He said he understood, he said he appreciated me being straight with him. He said there was no pressure and he would figure something else out. And the call ended warmly, with the specific warmth of a person who is already looking at the next door before the conversation is even over. What I did not know at the time was that he had already been discussing the car with Petra. I found this out later, much later, through a sequence of events I set in motion myself, and not because I was suspicious at the time of the phone call. I was not. I had said no, and I had expected that to be the end of it, because I had always underestimated, in small and specific ways, the gap between what Cade said and what Cade did. I had always given him the benefit of a doubt that he had never done much to earn, not because I was naive, but because he was my brother, and because believing the best about the people you grew up with is a habit that runs deeper than reasoning. The thing that changed my understanding came 3 months before the wedding, at my mother's house on a Sunday evening. Cade and Petra were there, and dinner had been cleared, and we were in that comfortable post-meal drift where people talk about nothing in particular while finishing the last of the wine. Cade asked me, in a tone of casual curiosity that I would later understand was anything but casual, whether I had given any thought to upgrading the Subaru. He said it with a sort of amused affection, as if the car were a joke we shared, as if its age and its modest market value were charming rather than perfectly functional. I said I had not thought about it. I said the car ran well and I had no reason to replace it. He said, right, of course. And he moved on to something else. And Petra, who had been watching him the way people watch someone who is about to do something inadvisable, looked down at the table. That look? I filed it the way I file everything. Not as accusation, not as certainty, but as data. A discrepancy between what was being said and what was being understood by the person in the room who knew the speaker best. The week after that dinner, I pulled the vehicle title out of the fireproof box in my closet. I keep all important documents in that box: title, insurance declarations, lease, will. I looked at the title. My name in full in the section designated for owner. No co-owner. No lien holder. No enholder. No encumbrance of any kind. A clean title to a vehicle worth approximately $5,000 on the private market, which is not a large sum, but which is a sum that can mean a great deal to a person who is short on options and too proud to borrow from any more obvious source. I sat with the title in my hands for about 10 minutes. Then I did something I had never done before with that vehicle, because until that Sunday dinner there had been no reason to do it. I drove to the county DMV satellite office the following Tuesday morning, and I filed a voluntary lien against the vehicle, in my own name. As the lien holder, secured against the vehicle's title, for the amount of $11,400, documented as the original purchase price structured as a personal loan. This is an unusual thing to do. The clerk who assisted me was a woman named Sandra, based on her name tag, and Sandra looked at my paperwork with the expression of someone encountering a legal mechanism they know is real but have never personally seen deployed. I was patient with her. I explained what I needed. I filled out every form correctly, as I always do, because I have spent 9 years learning exactly how to fill out every form correctly, and I walked out of that satellite office 24 minutes after I had walked in with a stamped copy of the updated title record, showing an active lien on the vehicle held by Delia R. Marsh. This made the title non-transferable without my signed, notarized release. No one could legally sell or transfer the vehicle without my documented authorization. The lien would show up in any standard title search. Any DMV processor doing their job correctly would catch it. Any processor cutting corners might not. I placed the original title, not the updated copy, into a sealed envelope and drove it to the office of Gretchen Polly, who has been doing title, property, and estate work in this county for 22 years. Gretchen is 61 years old and has the manner of someone who has seen every possible variety of human behavior in legal matters and has long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She is not warm in the conventional sense, but she is completely reliable in every sense that matters, which I have found to be a combination that is far rarer and more valuable than warmth alone. She logged the envelope into her client files without asking why I was depositing a vehicle title for safekeeping, and without offering an opinion on what might prompt such a thing. She simply logged it. Then she asked if there was anything else. I said no thank you, Gretchen. She said, you know where to find me, and she went back to whatever she had been working on before I arrived. I drove home. I made dinner. I put a new pine air freshener in the car because the old one had faded past the point of being useful. And I hung it from the mirror stem the way my father had hung the first one, looping it over by hand, and I sat in the parked car for a moment in the smell of cheap pine and October air coming through the cracked window. Then I went inside. I did not think about the title again for 11 weeks. Welcome back to the Calm Revenge episodes. This episode is about the specific kind of hurt that comes not from strangers, but from the people who know exactly what something means to you and take it anyway, because they have decided that your steadiness is the same as your permission. If that sentence landed somewhere specific in your chest, stay with the story. Leave a comment before you leave this video, and if you are not subscribed yet, please do that now so the next episode finds you without you having to look for it. The reason to think about the title again arrived 11 weeks after I filed it, on a Wednesday morning in early spring. I was at my desk reviewing a batch of fleet acquisition documents, the kind of work that requires attention but not imagination. The kind I can do while the rest of my mind is half on something else. My phone buzzed with an alert from the title monitoring service our company subscribes to. We use it to flag activity on any VIN in our client database. 2 years earlier, the week I bought the Subaru, I had added its VIN to my personal monitoring account as a matter of professional habit. I had done it the same way I do everything title-related, automatically without ceremony, because the cost of monitoring was $8 a year and the cost of not knowing was open-ended. The alert told me that someone had submitted a title transfer application for my vehicle at a DMV processing office on the west side of the city, 31 miles from my apartment, on a Tuesday morning. While I was at my desk, I noticed the information almost from a distance, the way I notice a filing error in a client batch, the way I notice a VIN that has been transposed, or a buyer signature that does not match the ID on file. It does not spike the pulse. It does not produce alarm in the theatrical sense. It sits there, wrong, patient, waiting to be addressed. I printed the alert. I set it on my desk. I sat for exactly 3 minutes, which I know because I watched the clock, a habit I have when I need to slow my thinking down rather than speed it up. Then I called Gretchen. She answered on the second ring. I gave her the VIN and the alert details. There was a pause of about 4 seconds. Then she said in her standard tone, which does not distinguish between good news and terrible news because she treats all information as information, "Well, that is not going to work." I said no, it is not. She asked if I wanted her to initiate a formal inquiry with the DMV's fraud unit, or whether I preferred to handle the documentation review myself first. I told her I wanted to come in, see the full file, and decide on a plan before taking any formal step. She said, "Thursday at 2. I said, "Thursday at 2. She said goodbye and hung up before I could respond, because Gretchen does not observe the social rituals around endings the way most people do. I did not call Cade. I did not send any message of any kind. I drove home that evening in my car, which was still legally and entirely mine, and I made pasta with jarred sauce because I was tired and I watched 35 minutes of something I do not remember on television, and I went to bed. I lay in the dark for a while. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about my father standing in that parking space with a little card in his hand. That particular look on his face that he had when he was about to say something he wanted to stick. "This is your car, Dee. Nobody else's." I almost sent a message that night. I drafted it twice. The first draft was 3 paragraphs long and explained what I had found and what I had filed and what was going to happen if he did not reverse the transfer application immediately. It was measured. It was clear. It laid out the situation with the precision of a compliance report. The second draft was 1 sentence. "I know what you filed and I know when you filed it." Neither one was sent. I deleted both, closed my phone, and looked at the ceiling for another while. Then I made a decision that I had, if I am honest, already made when I walked out of that DMV satellite office 11 weeks earlier, with the stamped lien copy in my hand. I let it run. Thursday at 2, Gretchen's office. She had already requested and received the DMV's preliminary record of the transfer attempt because Gretchen does not wait for meetings to begin working on problems she was told about on Tuesdays. The documents were arranged across her desk in a row, not stacked, but laid flat and separate, the way she always works, so that every page is equally visible and nothing is obscured by anything else. She went through them in order. The voluntary lien filing I had made 11 weeks earlier. The vehicle title history showing my unbroken ownership since 2017. The title monitoring alert from Wednesday morning. The DMV's preliminary record of the transfer attempt, filed Tuesday, using a photocopy of the original title I had deposited with Gretchen before the lien was filed, which meant someone had photographed or scanned the original at some point before I moved it to her office. The signature on the transfer application was not mine. Someone had made an attempt to replicate it. It was not poor work. If I were reviewing it casually, I might have looked twice. But I have reviewed tens of thousands of title signatures over 9 years, and I know my own signature the way a musician knows a note played half a step off. Not wrong enough for an untrained ear, but absolutely wrong. Gretchen said, "The lien makes this transfer void on its face. The DMV cannot complete any transfer against a notated lien without the lien holder's signed release. And the signature issue creates a secondary problem that is separate from the lien and considerably more serious in terms of legal exposure." I asked her what the outcome would have been if the transfer had been submitted and processed before I filed the lien. She said, "The vehicle would have been legally transferred to whatever name was on the application, and you would have had a much longer and more complicated road to recovery if you recovered it at all." I asked her how much the car would have sold for on the private market. She said for that year, that model, that mileage, somewhere between $40,500 and $6,000 depending on condition and the buyer. I said he needed money for the wedding. She said yes, that seems to be the working theory. I said he would have gotten $5,000 and I would have gotten a fraudulent transfer notification and a title dispute. She said yes. I said, "What does he get instead?" She looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "A permanent DMV fraud finding, provided you report it, and a legal position that would be very difficult to defend in any subsequent proceeding." That was the most expensive mistake my brother had made in his life, and he did not have any idea yet that it had happened. The question I asked myself in the days after that Thursday meeting, and that I kept asking myself through the remaining weeks before the wedding, was whether there was a version of this that I had contributed to. I am not, by temperament, someone who assigns all fault outward. I have been trained by both my profession and my nature to look at a situation and ask what each party's role was, what each decision produced, what the chain of causation actually looks like when you trace it back to the beginning rather than starting it at the convenient moment where someone else's behavior becomes the subject. I had not lent him the money. That was a decision I made, and I stand by it because I did not have the money to lend, and I will not borrow from one source to give to another just to avoid a difficult conversation. I had not attended enough of his wedding planning events to demonstrate the kind of visible enthusiasm he had perhaps hoped for. I had been, in the months before the wedding, somewhat withdrawn, not from him specifically, but from the world generally, which happens to me sometimes in long winters and which I recognize and manage, but cannot always prevent. I had been the kind of person, for most of our adult lives, who says what she means and means what she says and does not perform emotions she does not feel, which can read, to someone who needs performance from the people around them, as coldness. But I had not forged his signature. I had not photographed his title. I had not walked into a government office and submitted a document that bore a falsified version of his name to claim ownership of something he had paid for with 11 years of savings. That distinction matters. Understanding what led to a thing is not the same as accepting responsibility for the thing. I can see clearly what I contributed to the texture of our relationship without accepting that my contribution is why he did what he did. He did what he did because he believed he could, and that I would absorb it. He was wrong about the second part. I want to pause here and say something about Cade that I have thought about carefully in the months since all of this resolved. I want to say it because I think the truth of a person is more complicated than the worst thing they do, and because I am not interested in a version of this story that requires me to make him into something simpler than he is. Cade grew up watching our father work. Our father worked constantly, carefully, and with a kind of dignified precision that I admired and that I think Cade found frightening. Our father never had enough. Not quite. Not by the measure of the neighborhood or the school or the people in his profession who had started at the same time he had and somehow arrived further along. He made it work. He always made it work. But it was work, and Cade watched it. And somewhere in Cade's understanding of the world, the idea of not having enough became connected to the idea of being found out, as if poverty were a secret you kept rather than a condition you managed. When he met Petra and her family, with their lake house and their financial advisor and their good shoes, he did not see a family to marry into. He saw a test he was afraid he would fail. He could have told me that. He could have said, "Dee, I am terrified of what Petra's family thinks of me. I am in over my head with this wedding budget. I do not know how to fix this without losing face." I would have listened. I would have helped where I could. I would have told him honestly where I could not. But Cade has never been able to say the words, "I am terrified," without them feeling to him like they cost him something he could not get back. So instead he looked at what was available to him, and what was available was my car, and he made the calculation. Understanding why a person does something is not the same as forgiving it. I am clear on that distinction. I understand what drove him. I understand the fear and the arithmetic and the desperate logic of a man who believed that $5,000 quietly taken was better than the truth loudly admitted. I understand it, and I do not forgive it, and both of those things are fully true at the same time. Gretchen and I agreed on a plan. She would formally report the fraudulent transfer attempt to the DMV's fraud unit, which would open an investigation and generate a case number. She would document the lien notation and the pre-lien title deposit in her records. She would prepare a complete file. We would take no other formal legal action until after the wedding, which was 7 weeks away. I would tell Cade nothing. I would attend the rehearsal dinner and the wedding as planned, and I would give no indication that anything had changed. She asked me once if I was sure about the timeline. She said, "You have legal grounds to move now." I said, "I know." She said, "Waiting gives him 7 more weeks." I said, "He has already done what he was going to do, and it did not work. Waiting gives him 7 more weeks to be exactly who he is in the most public setting of his life." She looked at me for a moment, and then she made a small sound and said, "Thursday at 10, 6 weeks from now, to finalize the documentation." I said, "Thursday at 10. I drove home. I made soup that evening, chicken soup from scratch, because making soup from scratch requires the kind of sustained, low-level attention that quiets the part of my mind that will run without stopping if I do not give it something to do with its hands. I stood at the stove for an hour and a half, and I did not think about the transfer application, or the forged signature, or the case number, or the wedding, 7 weeks away. I thought about the soup. In the weeks between that Thursday and the wedding, Cade began a quiet public campaign. I say public because it was not directed at me. It was directed at the people around me, the family members and old friends who formed the soft architecture of our shared social world, the people whose good opinion he would want on his side in any future accounting of events. He worked through the family group chat and through individual phone calls, and he worked carefully, the way someone works when they are not sure what they are preparing for but want the foundation in place before they need it. I know what he said because 3 people called me to report it. An aunt called me on a Sunday afternoon and said carefully that Cade had mentioned I was being difficult about the wedding costs, that I had not been willing to help when he was struggling, and that she just wanted me to know she had heard it, but was not sure she believed it. A cousin texted me that Cade had told her I had money put away that I refused to share with family. Another cousin called to say that Cade had mentioned I was, in his words, someone who keeps a ledger, meaning that I tracked favors and expected them returned with interest. None of these people said they believed him. All of them conveyed the information with the slight breathlessness of people who are not sure whether they are being helpful or harmful by passing it along, and have decided to let me make that determination. I thanked each of them for telling me and said nothing more. His line, the one he used repeatedly across these conversations, was the one I had already heard. He deployed it in the family group chat in a post that was ostensibly about something else, a comment someone had made about family obligations, and he wrote, "Some of us learned early on that real love doesn't come with a ledger." 12 people liked it. 3 people replied with heart emojis. I read it while I was at my desk and I felt my pulse from a slight remove, the way you feel the temperature of a room change when someone opens an outside door. Not sharp, not hot, just present and noted. He said it again on a phone call with my mother that she relayed to me inadvertently, describing the call as him being very stressed about the wedding and saying something sweet about family. She said, he said something about love not needing a ledger, isn't that nice? I said, yes, Mom. He said it a third time directly to my face. But that comes later. What Cade did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that everything he said in those 7 weeks was being understood in a context he had not chosen. Every communication that positioned me as the difficult, withholding, ledger-keeping sibling was being filed alongside the title monitoring alert and the fraudulent transfer attempt and the forged signature. He was not preparing public sympathy in advance of a conflict. He was building the character description of a man who would forge his sister's signature on a vehicle title 7 weeks before his wedding, which is a very different thing from the character he thought he was building. The week before the wedding, Gretchen and I met on Thursday at 10 as scheduled. She had everything. The formal case number from the DMV fraud unit, the transfer attempt documentation, the lien filing and the dated receipt, the title deposit log from her own records, the full chain. She laid it across her desk and I looked at it for a moment, and then I said, "Is there anything missing?" She said, "Not from a documentation standpoint." I said, "And the recovery?" She said, "I have spoken with the appropriate service and they are available for a Saturday afternoon pending venue confirmation." I said, "I spoke with the venue coordinator on Tuesday." She said, "Then we are ready." I asked her one more question. I said, "Gretchen, if I call him this week and give him the opportunity to cancel the transfer attempt himself, file an amendment, and come to me, is there a legal benefit to that?" She said, "Legally, no. You have a clean case either way." I said, "Is there a personal benefit to it?" She paused, which for Gretchen is the equivalent of a long silence. Then she said, "That depends on what you need from this." I thought about it. Then I said, "I need him to know I gave him the chance." She said, "Then give him the chance." I called Cade on a Thursday evening, 6 days before the wedding. He answered on the third ring. He sounded preoccupied, or perhaps relieved, as if he had been waiting for a normal conversation to prove something to himself. I said, "Cade, I need to talk to you about something, and I am telling you now because I want to give you the opportunity to handle it privately before anyone else is involved." He said, "What is it?" I said, "I know about the transfer application." There was a silence. He said, "What transfer application?" His voice had shifted about 3 degrees, a change that someone who did not know him well would not have noticed. I know his voice like I know my own signature. I said, "The one you filed at the DMV satellite office on Trent Avenue 3 months ago." Another silence, longer. Then he said, "Whatever you think happened, whatever you've told yourself." I said, "I'm not asking you to admit it on the phone. I am asking you to contact the DMV in the next 48 hours and withdraw the application. If you do that, we handle this as a family matter and it does not go further." He said, "You are out of your mind." He said it quietly, not loud, which was interesting. Loud would have been easier for me to discount. He said, "You are making things up because you cannot stand that I'm happy, because you have always been the one who." I said, "I have the case number, Cade. There is already a fraud finding open. I am giving you the chance to stop it there." He said, "Some of us learned that real love doesn't come with a ledger." There it was. The third time, to my face, on the phone. 6 days before his wedding. I listened to it. I let it sit in the air between us for a moment. Then I said, "I love you." I said it, and I meant it in the way I have always meant it, which is not warmly, not with softness, but with the plain factual accuracy of someone reporting something true. I love my brother. I do not like what he did. Those two things have lived in the same space for as long as I can remember, and they will continue to do so. Then I said, "I'll let it run." And I did. I want to describe this final 6 weeks. Because I think the waiting is the part of this kind of story that gets left out. And it should not be left out, because the waiting is where most of it happens. Not the filing or the legal mechanism or the confrontation. The waiting. I went to work every day and I did my job well. Because the work does not stop, because your personal life is complicated. And because I find the work genuinely absorbing in a way that has always helped me when everything else is difficult. I reviewed title chains and spotted the errors in them and wrote up the findings and moved on to the next file. I ate lunch at my desk most days. I drove home in the Subaru, and I smelled the pine when I got in on cold mornings, and I thought about my father, not with grief, not anymore, but with the steady quiet company of someone who is gone, but whose presence is not gone, who left things in you that you keep finding as you move through your life. I had dinner with a friend named Claire on a Friday in early September. Claire knows me well enough to know when something is happening, and patient enough not to demand to know what. She said over the second glass of wine, "You seem like you're waiting for something." I said, "I am." She said, "Good waiting or bad waiting?" I thought about it. I said, "Clarifying waiting." She considered this. She said, "I'll take it." We talked about other things. The week before the wedding, I went over the documentation one final time with Gretchen on a Thursday morning. She had the full file. Case number, transfer attempt record, lien filing with timestamps, the stamped copy from the DMV, the deposit log from her office. Everything in order, everything dated, everything undeniable. She asked me once more if I was prepared for the public dimension of what was about to happen. I said I was. She said, "It will be unusual." I said, "I know." She said, "People will have opinions." I said, "They will have them regardless." She looked at me over her glasses for a moment, and then she said, "That's correct." And she moved to the next item on the list. The night before the wedding, I was in bed by 10:30. I slept without difficulty, which surprised me when I woke up and remembered it. I made coffee. I looked out the window at the parking lot where the Subaru sat. I thought, today is the last day it will have been an open question. After today it will be resolved, one way or another, and whatever I feel about the resolution will be what I feel, and I will manage it. The wedding was on a Saturday in October. The venue was Thornfield Hall, a restored 19th century estate property about 40 minutes from my apartment. 14 acres, a main hall with original millwork, a garden terrace with a pergola that Petra's mother had seen in a photograph in a bridal publication and had decided was the non-negotiable backdrop for the ceremony. The rental fee for the space was, I was told by a cousin who had looked it up out of curiosity, somewhere between $8,000 and $11,000 for a full-day event, not including catering, flowers, or music. I arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon in a rental car. A 2022 Honda CR-V, silver, from a company near my apartment. I had reserved it the previous Tuesday. I wore a gray crepe dress and flat shoes, and I had done nothing unusual with my appearance. I looked like someone attending a wedding. I was. The main hall was everything a wedding hall in October should be. The afternoon light came through tall windows at the low angle of that time of year, the kind of light that makes even ordinary spaces look considered. There were white and pale green flowers on every surface, the kind of arrangement that is expensive without announcing its expense. Guests moved through the corridor and gathered on the terrace, and Petra's family formed their cluster near the garden entrance, the way family clusters do when they are both hosting and being hosted at the same time, with a kind of watchful graciousness. I found a position near the back of the hall where I could see the corridor and the entrance to the garden terrace. I did not approach anyone. I waited. Cade saw me from across the room at approximately 1:37. He was in his suit, charcoal with a narrow lapel, good cut, either bought for the occasion or rented from somewhere that does good work. His face did the thing it does when he is surprised by something he does not want to show surprise about, a small arrested motion, a recalibration, and then the warmth rolls out. He crossed the room toward me and his hands were already out, that open-armed approach he has always used in public. The gesture that says, "I have no defenses," and requires no response to prove it. He said it, "You came. You look wonderful. I'm glad you're here." He put a hand on my shoulder, and the warmth of the hand was real in the physical sense, which is the thing that makes him complicated. I said, "Congratulations, Cade." "I meant it." He said, "I know things have been strange between us, and I want you to know that today I hope we can." I said, "I tried to reach you last week." He said, "I know. Things have been absolutely crazy with everything. I've been meaning to." I said, "There is something that is going to happen in a few minutes, and I want to give you one more chance to handle it privately." He stopped. The warmth in his face did not go away entirely, but it became complicated, layered over with something else. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Your transfer application was voided by the lien. The fraud case number has been active for 6 weeks. There is a recovery vehicle arriving at 1:45. If you go to Diane right now and explain the situation, she may be able to manage the logistics." He stared at me. He said, "You actually did this." He said it not as a question. He said, "On my wedding day. You actually—" I said, "I called you 6 days ago." He said, "I told Petra you wouldn't do anything." He said it the way you say something that has just been proven wrong before your eyes, and the wrongness of it is still landing. I said, "I know you did." He said, "Some of us learned that real love doesn't come with a ledger." The fourth time. I watched it come out of him, and I understood that it had become involuntary by then. The line, that it was something he said when he did not know what else to say and needed to believe he still had the moral ground. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I know you were afraid, Cade. I know what you were afraid of, and I know why. I understand it. But the car is mine. What you filed is a forgery. The case number is in my wallet if you need it before I leave." I do not know what he said after that because I had already turned toward the window. I watched the corridor. At 1:42, I saw the recovery vehicle in the far end of the parking lot. White flatbed, company name on the door. Driver with a clipboard already consulting with someone from the venue. Professional and unhurried. At 1:45, almost exactly, the driver began the process of loading the Subaru onto the flatbed. The sound of a flatbed recovery is not a subtle sound. It is hydraulic and mechanical, and it moves through walls and windows and over the sound of a string quartet. I know this because a string quartet had begun playing at 1:44 in the garden, and I could still hear the flatbed clearly from inside the hall. And I had positioned myself about 60 feet closer to the hall than to the garden. I understand from a cousin who was standing near the terrace that the sound reached the wedding party at approximately 1:48, which was about 90 seconds after the processional had begun and 50 seconds before Petra was scheduled to enter the garden. I understand that Cade left the altar. I understand that he moved quickly through the garden gate and across the near lot, and that he arrived at the parking area in time to see his silver Subaru Outback being secured to a flatbed recovery vehicle, and that he said my name twice, loudly, and then said a number of other things that several guests reported hearing from the terrace. I will not detail those other things. They were loud and they were not organized around any central point, and they did not change anything about the documentation. I was inside the hall near the entrance. I had moved away from the window when the flatbed arrived, because I had not come to watch. I had come to be present, and I had been present. And now I was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to leave. I stood near a floral arrangement, and I waited. Petra's mother retrieved Cade from the parking lot. I observed this through the corridor window, briefly. She was composed in the way that women of her particular background are composed, which is to say that she managed her face while her thinking was doing something different from her expression. She walked beside Cade back toward the garden, and she said something to him that I could not hear, and he nodded in the specific way of someone receiving direction they are in no position to refuse. The ceremony resumed at 2:17. I know the time because I checked my phone when I heard the music change. They were married. I am told the rest of the ceremony was conducted without incident. I slipped out during the recessional when all eyes were on the couple walking back up the aisle. I walked through the side corridor and out the service entrance, which I had identified when I arrived, because identifying the exit is a habit I developed long ago in situations where I knew I might need to leave without discussion. I walked across the near lot to the rental car. Before I reached it, I passed Petra's father, who was standing just outside the hall entrance with his arms crossed. He was watching the garden. He had the expression of a man who is quietly updating a significant amount of his previous thinking. He did not look at me. I did not stop. Near the edge of the parking lot, I passed Marcus, who is Cade's oldest friend, and who had been his groomsman, and who I have always found to be more perceptive than Cade gave him credit for. Marcus looked at me and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing their words with care. Then he said, "He told all of us you wouldn't actually do anything." I said, "I know he did." Marcus said, "I told him last week that he was making a mistake. He said it without heat, just as information." I nodded. I kept walking. I got into the rental car. I did not look back at the building. I drove to a gas station about 4 miles down the road, and I sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes with the engine running, and then I drove home. Subscribe so this finds the next person who needs it. If this story found you, there is a reason for that. Pass it along. In the 3 weeks that followed, while the Subaru was in the possession of Gretchen's bonded storage facility pending completion of the formal record, Cade called me 4 times and sent 7 texts. I did not answer the calls. I read every text. The arc of those messages was something I recognized from professional experience. The same arc you see in a compliance dispute when someone realizes the documentation is against them and moves through the stages of trying to make it go away. The first texts were angry and attributed the entire situation to my character rather than to his actions. The second texts explained the pressure he had been under and the impossible position he had found himself in, and the degree to which he had not thought clearly and had made a mistake he regretted. The third texts arrived over 3 days and were longer and quieter, and said, in different formulations, that he was my brother, and he had always loved me, and he was asking me to find a way to move through this. I read all of them. I did not respond to any of them, not because I was punishing him, because there was nothing I could say that would not either falsely soften what had happened or escalate it into something I did not want it to be. I needed the record to stand alone. My mother called on the 3rd day. She said she needed to understand what had happened. I told her. From the beginning, the title monitoring alert, the lien I had filed before the transfer attempt, the forgery finding, the case number, the timeline. I told her in order and without inflection, the same way I would brief a colleague on a compliance case. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "He should not have done that." I said, "No," she said, "I don't know how to fix this." I said, "You do not have to fix anything," she said. "I want you to know I understand what the car meant." I looked at the pine air freshener hanging on my kitchen cabinet where I had put it while the car was in storage. I said, "I know you do, Mom." The DMV fraud unit closed the case formally 8 days after the wedding with a finding of fraudulent title transfer attempt. The finding is permanent. It is part of Cade's name in that database. No criminal charges were pursued. That was my decision, made after a consultation with Gretchen, who presented it as a choice and said nothing beyond presenting it. I thought about criminal charges and what they would produce and what they would cost, and I decided that the permanent civil finding was sufficient. Sufficient for the record. Sufficient for any future context in which the question of reliability or honesty came up in connection with either of our names. He had forged my signature on a legal document in front of a state agency. That fact now exists independent of whether I tell anyone about it, independent of whether he ever admits it, independent of whether our family ever speaks of it directly. It is in the record. It will be there in 7 years. It will be there in 20. He wrote his own verdict. He just never read it back before he filed it. The car came back to me on a Tuesday. I drove to the storage facility and collected it, and I stopped at a gas station on the way home and filled the tank, which I had not done before leaving it at the Hargrove Inn, because I had not known that night that I would be leaving it there indefinitely. I drove home on familiar roads in familiar traffic. I pulled into my parking spot. I sat in the car with the engine off for a while. The pine air freshener that had been hanging in the car through all of it was still there. It had been through the inn parking lot and the recovery and the flatbed and the storage facility and the drive home. It was past its useful life, faded to almost nothing, but it was still present in a technical sense. I unhooked it from the mirror. I held it in my hand. I set it on the passenger seat. I drove the rest of the way home. That evening, I took the 4 old plastic sleeves out of the glove compartment, the ones I'd been keeping since the beginning, 5 of them now, with this one. I put them on the kitchen counter and I looked at them for a moment. They are not valuable. They are the discarded packaging of 5 cheap cardboard air fresheners. But they are also the record of the time I drove that car, from the day my father hung the first one over my mirror through everything that followed. And I am a person who keeps records, and so I kept them. I put them in the small wooden recipe box on the shelf, the one my mother gave me the Christmas after my father died, which I have kept filled with his recipe cards. The pine sleeves are in the front pocket of the box. They stay there. A week after I got the car back, I bought a new air freshener, same brand, same pine scent, same plastic sleeve. I looped it over the mirror stem the way my father had looped the first one. Same hand motion, same height on the stem. The car smelled of pine again on cold mornings. It smells of pine now. Petra called me once, about 6 weeks after the wedding. I did not expect this. She said she was not calling to defend what Cade had done or to ask for anything from me. She said she wanted to tell me that she had not known about the transfer attempt before the afternoon in the parking lot, and that she needed me to know that, and that she hoped I believed her. I said I believed her. She said she was trying to understand the full shape of the person she had married, which was not a simple thing, and that she was working through it. I said I understood that. She said, "Your father sounds like he was a good man." I was quiet for a moment. I said he was. She said, "I could tell from what you said to Cade in the hall." I had not been aware I had said anything about my father to Cade in the hall. Perhaps I had. Perhaps some things come out of you in those moments regardless of intention. I thanked her for calling. She said she would be in touch sometime. I said I hope so. Gretchen called 2 months after the wedding to close the file. She said everything was in order and the lien notation had been formally released since the vehicle was no longer under any threat of transfer. She said she would retain a complete copy of the file for 7 years as standard practice, and that I could request a copy at any time. I said, "Thank you, Gretchen." She said, "You did the right preparation." I said, "I had good professional instincts and a lot of time." She made a sound that I have learned over the years to recognize as her equivalent of laughter, and then she said, "That's generally all it takes," and then she ended the call because Gretchen does not waste time on endings. The financial accounting stated plainly because I think clarity matters. Cade's wedding ultimately cost him and Petra somewhere just over $41,000 when the final bills were settled, including the venue, the catering, the flowers, the block of hotel rooms, and several other line items that the cousin who knows about these things reported with mild horror. In addition to this, he retained an attorney for approximately 6 weeks before disengaging from that representation, which I am told cost him an additional $2,300. His total financial outlay associated with the event and its aftermath was somewhere in the range of $43,000 to $45,000. His attempt to alleviate a portion of this cost by transferring my vehicle produced nothing for him except a permanent fraud finding, a document chain that will follow his name in that database for at least 7 years, and a legal record that exists independent of any family interpretation of events. He attempted to recover approximately $5,000 and instead created a permanent public record of fraud and a legal bill. "My car is worth approximately $5,000 on the private market," he wrote his own verdict. He just never read it back. There are things I know now that I did not know going into this, not about the legal mechanisms or the documentation. All of that I knew, but about myself. I know now that I am capable of holding something this serious for this long without the holding of it distorting me. I had not been certain of that before. I had not known whether the waiting would make me bitter or whether the confrontation would make me regretful, or whether the outcome would make me feel something I did not want to feel. Some version of satisfaction that I would then have to examine and come to terms with. None of those things happened. The waiting made me clear. The confrontation was simply what it was, a thing that needed to happen, happening in the time and place I had chosen, with the documentation in order. The outcome made me feel mostly tired. A very specific kind of tired, the kind that follows a long task correctly completed. Not empty, not triumphant, just done. I spoke with Gretchen once more in the months after, not about the case but about something else entirely. A question I had about updating my own estate documents, which I was in the process of doing. She answered my questions and then, at the end of the call, said something she had never said before in the 9 or 10 times we had spoken over the previous year. She said, "For what it's worth, you handled that as well as I've seen anyone handle something like it." I said, "Thank you, Gretchen." She said, "It's not a compliment, it's an assessment." I said, "I know." And then she ended the call, because she always ends the call. I have not spoken to Cade since the day of the wedding. Not because I have made a formal decision never to speak to him again, but because neither of us has initiated it, and neither of us has found a reason to. I do not carry this as a wound. I carry it as an open question that does not require an urgent answer. Perhaps one day we will sit somewhere and talk about it honestly, about the fear and the arithmetic and the forgery, and the recovery and the pine air freshener on the mirror, about our father and what he left us and what we made of it. Perhaps we will not. I am not in a hurry either way. What I know is this. I want to say one final thing before I close this, and I want to say it carefully, because I think it is the truest thing I have to offer. The people who take things from the quiet ones are almost never doing it out of simple cruelty. They are doing it out of the specific and unexamined belief that the quiet one's capacity for absorbing loss is infinite. They have watched the quiet ones survive everything that has happened so far, and concluded, without reasoning it through, that the surviving is the same as the consenting. They are wrong about that. They are also wrong about something more specific. They believe that a person who does not make noise is not keeping records. They are very wrong about that. I have been keeping records since I was 22 years old and sat down at a title processing desk and learned that the difference between a legal transfer and a fraudulent one is almost always a piece of paper that somebody filed correctly or did not. The paper does not care about the relationship between the parties. The paper does not care who raised their voice and who did not. The paper simply records what happened in the order it happened, with dates and signatures, and it waits. I keep records. I always have. It is what I do professionally, and it is what I do personally, and those two things have never been entirely separate. I made split pea soup last Sunday. My father's recipe, from the note card in his handwriting that lives in the front of the wooden box on my kitchen shelf, the same box where the pine sleeves are now. It takes about an hour and 20 minutes from the first cut to the last stir, and it fills the apartment with a smell that belongs specifically to winter Sundays when I was small and the world outside was cold, and the world inside was sufficient. I made the soup. I ate a bowl of it at my kitchen table with the window cracked so the cold air could come in alongside the warmth, the way he used to keep it. I did not think about the wedding, or the title, or the case number, or the fraud finding, or the attorney, or the $41,000 that my brothers spent trying to look like enough for a family that has since, by several accounts, formed their own quiet assessment of his character. I thought about the soup. I thought about the recipe card and the handwriting on it, and the man whose handwriting it was. After I washed the pot, dried it, put it back on its shelf. That is where I am now. The car is in the lot. The air freshener is on the mirror. The recipe box is on the shelf. And the record is what it is.